is considering the Museums of History New South Wales Bill 2022. The question is that the bill be read a second time, and I call the member for Monaro.
Thank you, Speaker. I rise to speak on the Museums of History Bill 2022. And access to government information is a vital part of our democratic process. It is a responsibility of public officials and the right of the contemporary citizen to, respectively, keep and access government information. This includes current records of government, those in active use, and historic records in all formats. In fact, this statement is deliberately format agnostic, a point that becomes more relevant as we proceed forward along the axis of time. More and more records are being created digitally, and physical records are requiring digitisation for the purposes of both preservation and accessibility. Current records of government being accessible gives rise to debate about current affairs and events, allows those in public office to be held accountable, and provides a trail of decision-making and evidence that is vital to judicial, parliamentary and research processes. Determining which records of government need to be retained, whether for a period of time or permanently, is the responsibility of the Board of the State Archives and Records Authority. This vital decision-making process is entirely preserved under the Museums of History Bill and safely housed within the State Records Authority, which has been set up specifically to support, educate and regulate record keeping within public offices. The State Records Board composition will now include representation of First Nations people and have the flexibility to include sectors that are not currently included, such as the university sector, who are, as public officers, covered by the State Records Act, but not permitted representation under the current governance arrangements. Also included on the board is representation from archives users. This was called for during the inquiry conducted by the Social Issues Committee into the policy positions that underpin this bill. I am pleased to see that this has been included in the bill before the House. Of the millions of state records created, most can be discarded soon after creation or as soon as their reference or administrative use ceases. By volume, this is the category in which the majority of records created by public officers lie. Others, although relatively fewer, are required to be retained for a period of time. The period for which they are kept depends on a range of requirements. These include legal considerations, community expectations, and the nature and utility of the records themselves. Within these broad categories of consideration is a wealth of nuance. The records themselves range from the footage captured by the speed cameras to Acts of Parliament itself. A select few are identified as having enduring value and required to be kept in perpetuity as part of the State Archives collection under the care of Museums of History New South Wales. As I said earlier, this identification process happens currently and is unchanged in the bill before the House. It is proposed to be undertaken by the State Records Authority, an agency dedicated to assisting and holding public officers accountable for their meeting in their record-keeping requirements. I repeat this point because it is important to note that this was not part of the original plan that was examined by the Social Issues Committee. The creation of the State Records Authority as a dedicated agency with a focused responsibility for record keeping ensures that this vital function can continue without compromise or distraction. This was a key concern raised in the inquiry conducted by the Social Issues Committee, and the earnest response to this concern is worthy of specific mention. It is a signal that our upper house standing committees are well functioning and of value. To ensure that material required for the State Archives collection is identified and ultimately transferred into the custody of Museums of History New South Wales, a new transfer planning requirement has been introduced as part of the bill before the House. Upon request, a public office is required to work on and submit a transfer plan to the Museums of History New South Wales. This process identifies the material of enduring value that remains in the custody of public officers. It helps the Museums of History New South Wales to understand the volume and value of material plan for its transfer, and ensure that they are resourced appropriately to take control of this material, leaving the public office to focus on their core business and reducing storage costs at the same time. All of this mitigates the risk that valuable documentary history is lost, destroyed, or inadvertently damaged, and can reduce costs and complexity for the public office transferring the records. Just as access to current records of government is vital, so too is the care for and discoverability of historic material. The bill before the House seeks to reduce the open access period from 30 to 20 years, in line with various domestic and international jurisdictional comparators. This means that more archives will be available for public access sooner, after 20 years as the default setting, rather than the current 30 years. When material is open under the State Records Act, it is open in its entirety and not redacted as material under other freedom of information legislation and mechanisms so often is. Specifically, the Government Information Public Access Act 2009 and Standing Order 52 requests both have mechanisms to redact parts of the records. This is to balance access and privacy, as the records accessed under these mechanisms tend to be very current. And so the term open access period and its place in the State Records Act earnestly reflects its intention to open the relevant archive in its entirety. This has always been fertile ground for researchers, historians, academics, commentators, and media. These records are also essential for citizens' rights and entitlements, understanding who they are and how government has impacted their day-to-day lives. Increasingly, curators, creatives, museums, writers, television producers, designers, and artists are using archival material for a range of uses, and this can only be a good thing. When the current State Records Act was drafted and the 30-year open access period was set, it was done so in the name of dignity, with the notion that 30 years was a respectful time to observe before information came to light. The contemporary thinking is that a shorter period actually affords a more enlightened and modern notion of dignity, and with it, a right of reply, as the record author and many of the protagonists mentioned in the records may well still be with us. Opening material earlier gives these individuals the opportunity to be involved in the subsequent analysis and debate, affording an element of natural justice to the process. Having the people who created or are featured in the archives participate in this discourse certainly adds to the fascination and the interest of the particular issues, topics, and policies under consideration. A number of years ago, the first public event was held to celebrate the release of the New South Wales Cabinet Papers from 30 years prior, right here in Parliament House. The Honourable Barry Unsworth, who was Premier at the time that the Cabinet Papers were created, spoke at the event, and it was broadcast live on Sky News. Mr Unsworth took the opportunity to call for earlier public release of these documents in the future, citing that had the Cabinet Papers been opened earlier, there would be others from the time in question still around to share their memories, perspectives, and thoughts. This encapsulates the point very well, and the move to adopt a 20-year open access period is done with this in mind, as well as the relevant comparison with other jurisdictions, such as the Commonwealth, who have adopted 20-year periods. Of course, not all material is suitable for release after 20 or even 30 years. Mental health records, for example, show that a balance between open access and privacy needs to be observed. This is another example of this balance too, again pertaining to Cabinet Papers. In all of this, to this end, I am pleased that the ability for a public office to close records for longer than 20 years for appropriate reasons is carried forward, unaltered into this bill. The structure of the newly proposed entities, Museums of History New South Wales, custodians of the collection of historic properties and archives, and the State Records Authority of New South Wales, working to support record keeping and compliance among public officers, is a huge step forward in valuing record keeping for both its short-term utility and longer-term contribution to the documentary history of our state. Accordingly, Speaker, I commend this bill to the House.
Thank the member for Monero. The question is that the bill be read a second time.